Everyone thought they were ready. Everyone braced for the unimaginable. But one teenager made a choice that saved her life while others around her lost theirs. This is the story of how a simple decision to change seats became the difference between life and death. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. And please, like and subscribe for more videos like this. Sarah Mitchell was 16 years old when she boarded Flight 447 on a clear Tuesday morning in March. She had her backpack slung over one shoulder and her phone in her hand, texting her best friend about the spring break trip she was taking to visit her grandmother in Portland. Sarah was traveling alone for the first time, and her mother had given her strict instructions about staying in her assigned seat, keeping her seatbelt fastened, and not talking to strangers. Sarah had rolled her eyes at the advice, but promised to follow it anyway. She walked down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, checking her boarding pass for the third time. Seat 23A, window seat. She had specifically chosen it when booking because she loved watching the clouds from above. When Sarah reached row 23, she found an elderly woman already sitting in the middle seat, 23B. The woman smiled warmly at her, and Sarah smiled back as she squeezed past to reach her window seat. She settled in, tucking her backpack under the seat in front of her and fastening her seatbelt. The plane was filling up quickly. Families with young children, business travelers in suits, college students heading home. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them. Sarah pulled out her earbuds and started scrolling through her playlist, trying to decide what music would be best for takeoff. She had always found something magical about the moment when the plane left the ground, that brief suspension between earth and sky. The elderly woman next to her was knitting something blue and soft, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. Sarah noticed the woman had kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced confidence. She wondered what the woman was making and for whom. Then something happened that would change everything. A flight attendant approached their row with an apologetic expression. She leaned down and spoke quietly to a man sitting across the aisle in seat. To 3D, there had been a mistake with the seating assignments. A family had been separated, and they needed to keep the young children together with their parents. Would the man mind switching seats? The man was gracious about it and gathered his things. The flight attendant then turned to Sarah. She explained that if Sarah would be willing to move to seat 38C toward the back of the plane, it would help keep the family together. Sarah hesitated. She really wanted her window seat. She had been looking forward to it, but the flight attendant looked stressed, and Sarah could hear a young child crying somewhere behind them. Her mother had always taught her to be helpful when she could. Sarah sighed and nodded. She unbuckled her seatbelt, grabbed her backpack, and stood up. The elderly woman with the knitting gave her an encouraging smile as Sarah excused herself and made her way down the aisle. She passed rows of passengers settling in, stowing luggage, fastening seatbelts. She walked all the way to the back of the plane, past the galley where flight attendants were preparing for departure. Row 38 was near the rear exit, just a few rows from the very back. Seat 38C was a middle seat, squeezed between a businessman typing furiously on his laptop and a young woman reading a thick paperback novel. Sarah squeezed into her new seat, feeling slightly annoyed about losing her window view, but trying to be positive about it. She refastened her seatbelt and pulled out her phone one more time before the announcement about electronic devices. She sent a quick text to her friend. Changed seats to help a family, now stuck in a middle seat in the back. So much for cloud watching. Then she switched her phone to airplane mode and tucked it away. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule. The takeoff was smooth. Sarah felt the familiar pressure as the aircraft accelerated down the runway, the slight lift as the wheels left the ground. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling that mix of excitement and nervousness that always came with flying. The plane climbed steadily, banking slightly as it turned toward its flight path. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Sarah settled in, trying to get comfortable in the cramped middle seat. She put in her earbuds and started listening to music, watching the businessman next to her continue working without pause. About 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed the flight attendants moving through the cabin with unusual purpose. Their faces looked tense, focused. She pulled out one earbud and tried to hear what they were saying, but they spoke in low voices to each other. Something felt different. The plane suddenly shuddered. It was not the normal turbulence that Sarah had experienced on other flights. This was something else. A violent shaking that made the overhead compartments rattle. The businessman next to her grabbed his laptop to keep it from sliding off his tray table. The woman on the other side dropped her book. Then came the announcement that made everyone freeze. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but serious. There was a problem with the aircraft. They were experiencing engine failure. The crew was working to resolve it, but passengers needed to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. The cabin erupted in worried murmurs. Sarah felt her heart start racing. She gripped the armrests tightly. Engine failure. Those words did not sound like something that could be easily fixed. The plane tilted, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. They were descending, too fast. The flight attendants were moving through the cabin again, this time checking that everyone's seatbelts were secure, that tray tables were up, that seats were in their upright positions. Their faces remained professionally calm, but Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. One of them stopped at Sarah's row and made eye contact with her. The attendant gave her a small nod, trying to be reassuring, but it only made Sarah more frightened. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, dangling in front of every passenger's face. Sarah had heard the safety demonstration 100 times, but had never imagined actually having to use the mask. With shaking hands, she pulled it down and placed it over her nose and mouth, securing the elastic band behind her head. Around her, other passengers were doing the same. Some were crying. Some were praying silently. Some sat in stunned silence. The businessman next to Sarah was trying to type something on his phone, probably a message to someone he loved. The captain came back on the intercom. His voice was still controlled, but there was an edge to it now. They were making an emergency descent. The crew was doing everything possible. Passengers needed to assume the brace position. Sarah had seen it demonstrated before every flight. Head down, hands behind your head or gripping your ankles. She leaned forward, pressing her head against the seat in front of her, her hands clasped behind her neck. Her whole body was trembling. This could not be happening. This could not be real. She thought about her mother, probably at work right now, with no idea that anything was wrong. She thought about her father, her younger brother, her best friend. She thought about all the things she still wanted to do, places she wanted to see, experiences she had not had yet. She was only 16. Around her, she could hear the sounds of other passengers, muffled sobs, whispered words, the flight attendants calling out instructions to remain calm, to stay in the brace position. The engines were making terrible sounds, roaring and sputtering. The plane was shaking so badly that Sarah thought it might come apart in the air. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to control her breathing through the oxygen mask. In that moment, Sarah thought about the seat she had given up. Row 23, seat A, by the window. She wondered if the child sitting there now was as terrified as she was. She wondered if her small act of kindness had meant anything at all in the face of this disaster. The descent seemed to last forever, but it was probably only minutes. The plane was going down. Everyone knew it. Everyone was preparing for impact. Everyone except Sarah had no idea that her decision to change seats had already saved her life. The impact was catastrophic. The plane hit the ground at a steep angle in an open field several miles from the airport. The sound was deafening, a horrible shriek of metal tearing and crumpling. The front section of the aircraft bore the brunt of the impact, crumpling like paper. The middle section twisted and broke apart. But the rear section, where Sarah sat, separated from the rest of the plane and slid across the field before coming to a stop. Sarah did not remember the actual moment of impact. 1 second she was in the brace position. The next she was being thrown violently against her seatbelt, and then everything went black for a few seconds. When she opened her eyes, she was hanging sideways in her seat. The plane had come to rest at an angle. Her ears were ringing. Smoke was filling the cabin. She could barely see. Her body hurt everywhere, but she could move. She was alive. The woman who had been reading next to her was slumped over, unconscious but breathing. The businessman was fumbling with his seatbelt, his face covered in blood from a gash on his forehead. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely unbuckle her own seatbelt. When it finally released, she half fell out of her seat. Emergency lights were flashing. She could hear screaming from somewhere in the wreckage. A flight attendant appeared through the smoke, shouting at everyone to move, to get out, to evacuate. Sarah stumbled toward the rear exit. Other passengers from the back section were doing the same. The emergency door was open, the slide deployed. Sarah half jumped, half fell onto the slide and tumbled down to the ground. She rolled away from the wreckage and lay in the grass, gasping for air, her whole body shaking. Other survivors were emerging from the rear section. Maybe 20 people, maybe more. They stumbled away from the burning wreckage, some helping others who could barely walk. Sarah tried to stand, but her legs would not hold her. She sat in the grass, staring at what remained of the aircraft. The front 2/3 of the plane were completely destroyed. Emergency vehicles were already approaching, their sirens wailing across the field. Firefighters rushed toward the wreckage, spraying foam on the flames. Paramedics ran to the survivors, checking injuries, calling out for stretchers. Sarah sat there in shock as a paramedic knelt beside her, asking her questions she could barely process. Was she hurt? Could she move? What was her name? She answered automatically, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. The paramedic checked her over, found cuts and bruises, but nothing broken, nothing life-threatening. Sarah was one of the lucky ones. As the hours passed and the full scope of the disaster became clear, the numbers were devastating. 163 people had been on board Flight 447. Only 28 survived. All of the survivors had been seated in the rear section of the aircraft. Everyone in the front and middle sections, including row 23, where Sarah had originally been assigned, had perished. The family that Sarah had given up her seat for, including the young child who took her place by the window, had not survived. The elderly woman who had been knitting beside her, was gone. The man who had switched seats before her was gone. Nearly everyone in those forward rows was gone. Sarah learned all of this later, in the hospital. As she lay in a bed with an IV in her arm and her parents sitting beside her, holding her hands and crying with relief. The news was covering the crash constantly. The deadliest aviation disaster in the region in over a decade. Investigators were already on the scene, trying to determine what had gone wrong. Initial reports suggested a catastrophic engine failure, followed by a loss of control. Sarah could not stop thinking about that moment in the aisle. The flight attendant asking her to move. Her hesitation. Her decision to be helpful. If she had said no, if she had insisted on keeping her window seat in row 23, she would be dead right now. If she had boarded the plane 5 minutes later and missed that seating change entirely, she would be dead. The randomness of it was almost impossible to process. The survivors were being called miracles. Sarah heard that word over and over in the days that followed. Miraculous, blessed, fortunate. But she did not feel miraculous. She felt guilty. She felt confused. She felt grateful and devastated at the same time. Why had she lived when so many others had not? What made her life more valuable than the child who took her seat? She attended memorial services for the victims. She watched families grieving, saw the photographs of the people who had been on that plane. Young and old, strangers who had become connected by tragedy. Sarah spoke to counselors, to other survivors. Some of them felt the same guilt she did. Others were just trying to make sense of being alive. The investigations continued. The cause of the crash was eventually determined to be a mechanical failure that could not have been predicted or prevented by the crew. It was not anyone's fault. It was just a terrible accident, but that did not make it easier to accept. Sarah returned to school months later. Her friends tried to treat her normally, but she could see the way they looked at her, like she was fragile, like she had been touched by something they could not understand. And they were right. Sarah had been changed by Flight 447 in ways she was still discovering. She thought about that decision every single day. The choice to give up her seat, to help a family stay together, to walk to the back of the plane. It had been such a small thing, such an ordinary act of kindness, and it had saved her life while costing others theirs. Sarah struggled with this for a long time. She saw therapists. She joined support groups for survivors. She tried to find meaning in what had happened. Eventually, slowly, she began to understand something important. She could not change what had happened. She could not bring back the people who had died. She could not explain why she had survived, but she could choose what to do with the life she had been given. Sarah decided to study aviation safety in college. She wanted to understand how accidents happened and how they could be prevented. She wanted to honor the people who died on Flight 447 by working to make sure fewer people would die in the future. She volunteered with organizations that supported families of crash victims. She spoke at safety conferences about the passenger perspective. She turned her survival into purpose. Years later, Sarah would visit the memorial that had been built at the crash site, a quiet place with the names of all who had been lost. She would stand there and remember the elderly woman with her knitting, the family that had needed to stay together, the crew members who had died trying to save their passengers, and she would remember that moment in the aisle when she had been asked to change seats. That random, ordinary, life-changing moment. Sarah never forgot that everyone on that plane had prepared for impact. Everyone had braced themselves. Everyone had faced the same terrifying descent, but only those in the back had survived. And she had been in the back only because she had chosen to be kind, to be helpful, to give up something she wanted for the sake of others. She did not know if there was a lesson in that or just randomness, but she knew that every day she lived was a gift that 135 others had not received. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe for more videos like this.